Hi, I'm Ted Franklin from System Change, Not Climate Change, and I'm hosting today's webinar from unceded Ohlone territory in Northern California. The call for net zero greenhouse gas emissions has been embraced by nearly everyone, environmentalists, politicians like California Governor Newsom, corporations, nations, and international bodies. But what does net zero really mean? Can net zero sufficiently address the climate crisis? And a term. Why are the biggest carbon polluters committing to net zero in their messaging on climate change? And what are eco-socialist climate organizers in Los Angeles doing to fight for decarbonization and real zero? What role can community-based electrification campaigns play in getting us where we need to go? Our presenters today are David Klein and Aura Vasquez. David Klein is a mathematical physicist and emeritus professor of mathematics at California State University Northridge. He's a member of Democratic Socialists of America and serves on the coordinating committee of System Change, Not Climate Change. David is the author of an ebook, Capitalism and Climate Change, The Science and Politics of Global Warming, and we'll put the link to that in the chat. The science and politics of global warming is a subject that David has been working on for many years, both as a scientist and as a political activist. And he's written about the follies of net zero for System Change's website. Aura Vasquez is chair of the DSA Los Angeles Climate Justice Committee. She has served on the board of commissioners of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. She has been a leader in the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign and securing a commitment from Los Angeles to go coal-free by 2025. Aura helped to pass LA's ban on single-use plastic bags and to retire 3 coastal gas plants. She's also organized around affordable housing and mutual aid to address issues facing vulnerable communities during the pandemic. After our presenters have spoken, there'll be time for Q&A. David?
Okay, let me just share screen here. How does that look? Can everybody see it okay?
Looks great.
Okay, well, let me start with the history of global warming at a glance. So in this graph, the horizontal axis at 0 represents the global average temperature for the entire 20th century. And then you see below that the years ranging from 1880 up to the present. 1880 was the first year when reliable temperature measurements could be taken. And when the blue bar goes below the horizontal line, that means that year was cooler than the global average temperature, and the red ones it was hotter. And so you see there's a definite trend here. The immediate physical cause of global warming is the greenhouse effect. And so what that means is that more radiation comes into the Earth climate system than leaves it. That's caused by these greenhouse gases. And the current radiative forcing, that's the difference between the amount coming in and going out, is called radiative forcing. The current radiative forcing is about 1 watt per square meter. So you can imagine, for every square meter around the world, a little Christmas tree light is there, constantly heating up the planet day and night. Well, this graph shows the kind of the history for the past 800,000 years. So the 800 on the horizontal axis there means 800,000 years. And so the concentration of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, has fluctuated. But if you look to the far right where it says now, there's a spike that goes way up. And so it turns out that I really need a bigger graph, because that spike is higher than the concentration of carbon dioxide for the past several million years, actually. Well, the question arises, how much hotter can we expect the Earth to get? And of course, as we all know, it depends on what we do in the meantime, what we do from now on, how much greenhouse gases we emit. And this chart comes from, excuse me, the IPCC report that came out in 2100. And you see on the far right, the likely range of various shared socioeconomic pathways that we choose to take. The one on top, the SSP 1-1.9, represents something that's almost too good to be true. Extremely attentive to emissions. And the one at the bottom is the worst case scenario. So the 8.5 there signifies the radiative forcing in watts per square meter by the end of this century compared to pre-industrial times. So that the range of increase goes from 1.2 degrees Celsius up to 5.7 degrees Celsius, according to the IPCC. That's relative to the global average between 1850 and 1900. So I want to ask about the worst case scenario in this slide. The 8.5 sort of has been described as business as usual in a lot of the publications. But in 2020, a couple of papers came out, and one of them published in Nature in early 2020, January, described a kind of an optimistic view of what's happening in the world right now. And so I'm just going to read a quote from that first column on the left. Happily, the paper says, that's a word we climatologists rarely get to use. The world imagined in RCP 8.5, that's that worst case scenario, is one that in our view becomes increasingly implausible with every passing year. But then later on in 2020, another paper came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I'll read you an excerpt for that one, which appears on the right side of your screen. Not only are the emissions consistent with RCP 8.5 in close agreement with historical total cumulative carbon dioxide emissions, actually within 1%, but RCP 8.5 is also the best match out to mid-century under current and stated policies, with still highly plausible levels of CO2 emissions in 2100. Okay, so that's certainly a possibility. There's some disagreement within the climate science community, but it's something we have to take seriously. So let me now ask the question, what is the significance of this pathway, RCP 8.5, with its 3.3 up to 5.7 degrees Celsius of warming? What would that mean for us, for the planet? Well, one way to think about it is to look to the past. So 20,000 years ago, during what is called the last glacial maximum, ice sheets covered Canada and the northern United States. New York City was a mile underneath the ice all year round. So was Chicago. There was so much ice on the land that sea level was almost 400 feet lower than where it is today. And the punchline is that the global average temperature was only about 4 or 5 degrees cooler compared to today. So this example raises the question, well, if 4 or 5 degrees cooler puts New York City underneath a mile of ice all year round, what would 4 or 5 degrees warmer do? Well, there's a whole bunch of papers. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. So in this paper, also from Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences in 2020, the paper said, in the worst case scenario, i.e. business as usual, so that's that RCP 8.5 that I was talking about, for every additional 1 degree rise in temperature, 1 billion people will be forced to migrate or endure insufferable heat. Areas home to 1/3 of the world's population will experience the same temperatures as the hottest parts of the Sahara within 50 years, with mean annual temperatures greater than 29 degrees Celsius compared to humanity's historical temperature niche of 11 to 15 degrees. So real catastrophe there. A couple more papers. A 2019 United Nations report and Nature article warned that up to 1 million species of plants and animals are on the verge of extinction, and it's already happening. A year later, an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reported that the ongoing mass extinction may be the most serious environmental threat to the persistence of civilization because it is irreversible. And according to another source, the 2022 World Wildlife Living Planet report, the average population size of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians declined by 69% in just the past 50 years. Well, we could go on and on about this gloomy stuff, but this one paper really kind of captured a whole bunch of other ones. Summarizing the findings of some 150 scientific studies, a 2021 paper with 17 authors warned, quote, "The scale of the threats to the biosphere and all its life forms, including humanity, is in fact so great that it is difficult to grasp for even well-informed experts." The paper went on to say, "The gravity of the situation requires fundamental changes to global capitalism, education, and equality, which include, inter alia, the abolition of perpetual economic growth, properly pricing externalities, a rapid exit from fossil fuel use, and many other changes." Well, I've been talking about the worst case scenario. Let me now turn to the question of lower increases in temperature. What would the consequences be? And of course, many people in the audience, I'm sure, are familiar with the special report put out by the IPCC in 2018, which talked about the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming versus 2 degrees of warming over pre-industrial times. And among the major findings was that this 0.5 degree difference would be the difference between a world with coral reefs and one without. And then the difference would be a world where Arctic sea ice disappears and where it doesn't. So 2 degrees of warming is expected to result in the death of all coral reefs in all the world's oceans, or very nearly so. And so the report went on to ask the question, well, what do we have to do to stay below 1.5 degrees? Well, to do that requires rapid reductions of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And many of the scenarios studied include carbon dioxide removal. So they assumed, the ability to remove significant amounts of it artificially, which, doesn't really match reality at this time. Well, let me now turn to the main topic, net zero. What does net zero mean? So the idea of net zero is to offset greenhouse gas emissions by removing equal amounts of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And the idea is to store the carbon in soils, plants, oceans, and possibly using artificial carbon capture and storage systems. So with net zero, the idea is that the concentration of greenhouse gases is stabilized. But the question which Ted raised at the very beginning is net zero a sufficient response to the climate crisis? So let me start with the easy part of that question, the question of fraud. So it's widespread. More than 130 countries, including Saudi Arabia, have established or are developing net zero targets. At least 1/5 of the world's largest corporations, representing some $14 trillion in sales, have announced net zero emissions targets by mid-century. even airline companies, collectively responsible for 5% of global warming, have net zero policies. Not so long ago, the Washington Post reported that 196 countries underreported their annual emissions by between 8.5 billion and 13.3 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. The significance is that the lower bound is greater than or equal to the annual emissions of the US, and the higher estimate is almost equal to those of China. By way of example of the kind of fraud that goes with this on a national level, Malaysia reported that its trees absorb carbon dioxide 4 times faster than those in the neighboring country of Indonesia. And that enabled Malaysia's report to eliminate more than 243 million tons of carbon dioxide with the stroke of a pen. A really unprecedented triumph for greenwashing. So what about these carbon offsets? So that goes with net zero greenwashing. The Guardian reported in an article last month, that the forest carbon offsets approved by the world's leading certifier and used by big corporations like Disney, Shell, Gucci, and others are largely worthless and could make global heating worse, according to a new investigation. The research has found that more than 90% of their rainforest offset credits, among the most commonly used by companies, are likely to be phantom credits and do not represent genuine carbon reductions. Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the science part of it, of net zero. So part of it relies on plants, and so the question is, well, how much can plants and soil absorb? What's the limit there? Plants absorb carbon dioxide via photosynthesis, but nearly all of that is eventually returned to the atmosphere through decay, ingestion by animals, or conflagration in a forest fire. So the trees are not really, it's sort of like if you plant a new tree, it's a one-time shot. As long as that tree is growing, it's absorbing carbon. But when the tree dies, it sends it back, unless you bury it deep in the earth or do something drastic. Deforestation has resulted in about 180 billion tons of carbon released to the atmosphere since pre-industrial times, 1750 or so. And plants and soils have reabsorbed some of that, about 80 billion tons. The amount of carbon that plants and soils can reabsorb before reaching saturation levels is limited. Soil scientists estimate a maximum additional holding capacity to be about 100 billion tons of carbon or less. And so that gives a total amount that, the maximum capacity is about the amount that nature was able to sequester before the industrial era in the first place. You can't really beat Mother Nature on this. And then, of course, there's the oceans. That's an important source. Oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface, and the interface between the ocean and atmosphere is huge. The two continually exchange vast amounts of carbon. The net flow of carbon is from the atmosphere to the oceans, a process that leads to ocean acidification. So putting it together, soils and plants currently absorb about 31% of humanity's carbon dioxide emissions, and the oceans absorb about 23%. So together, a little bit more than half of our emissions into the atmosphere. But these carbon sinks will eventually weaken in response to continuing emissions. That's partly because, warmer ocean waters are less able to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And of course, the soils and plants have saturation levels as well. Well, another piece of the puzzle is described in this paper. a comprehensive study of Earth's energy imbalance. Remember, I talked about radiative forcing being about 1 watt per square meter now. That's the rate at which the Earth is heating. So this study came out in 2019 when the radiative forcing was measured to be about 0.87 watts per square meter, although there was a pretty large error range within that included 1 watt per square meter, but that was the best estimate. The paper says the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would need to be reduced from 410 to 353 parts per million to increase heat radiation to space by that amount, by the amount of the radiative forcing, thereby bringing Earth back into energy balance. And so notice the 353 parts per million is pretty close to the name of the organization, 350.org, which, you know, Hansen had estimated pretty accurately some years back. Earth system models indicate that stabilizing the climate at a given temperature requires that greenhouse gas emissions be reduced to near zero and not merely net zero. Right, so stop emitting altogether rather than replacing the carbon in the atmosphere with the carbon that has been absorbed. So this slide shows some uncertainty, even with real zero, you know, even with very close to zero emissions. So the thing to look at is the graph on the right. It's a very messy looking graph. I don't know if you can see it very well, but the horizontal axis measures time in years from a point in time in which the Earth goes to zero emissions, right? So this is totally hypothetical. So imagine if we were just, you know, suddenly cut all emissions down to zero. And the kind of spider web looking wavy gray, light gray graphs that go above and below that dark line are various climate model experiments that for you know, what would happen if we suddenly reach absolute zero. So the dark line is the average of all of them, but some of those, you know, spider web looking little graphs go up pretty high, right? About half a degree. So even with total zero, you know, not just net zero, but real zero, there's some uncertainty as to how much warming we would experience in the next few decades. I mean, on average, it looks pretty good, you know, as it goes up a little bit at first, you know, for a couple of decades, and then it goes down, starts to decrease. But you can't know for sure, you know, which of these models is closest to reality. So even real zero is, you know, I mean, it's not a walk in the park. Net zero is much worse. Well, okay, so away from the gloom and doom, let me talk about more optimistic things. Can we save ourselves? Well, yes. I mean, there's no barrier with technology, no technological barriers to saving ourselves. As an example, Mark Jacobson, a professor at Stanford, in 2015 gave congressional testimony that presented roadmaps for 139 countries and all 50 of the United States to transition to 100% clean, renewable wind, water, and solar power for all purposes by 2050, and even 80% by 2030. And there are other reports. I put one on the right side of the page there. I don't really want to talk about that one, but there's all kinds of similar studies, and they're pretty much in agreement that we do have the technology to save ourselves, or at least, you know, limit the damage, you know, very significantly, and yet we're not doing it. In fact, we're headed in the wrong direction. So I want to point out a couple of things about that. The International Energy Agency in 2021 warned that no fossil fuel projects should be developed if the world is to meet its climate goals. So what happened? And what's been happening? Well, the International Monetary Fund found that globally, fossil fuel subsidies were $5.9 trillion in 2020, or about 6.8% of GDP, and were predicted to rise beyond that in 2025. So the world's governments are paying fossil fuel companies to make more fossil fuel. And you look at the chart on the right, it tells you the amount of atmospheric growth of carbon dioxide for each decade, starting in 1960, going up to the present. And so the units are parts per million. That keeps increasing. So we're accelerating, measured in decades, we're accelerating. 1 part per million is more than 2 billion tons of carbon. So that's a lot. Each part per million is a lot. Well, why is it so hard to do what we really need to do to save ourselves? Well, the problem is we need to shut down not only fossil fuel industries, but also the industries that depend on fossil fuels. So it's a complete remake of society. For example, automobile, aircraft, airline, shipping, petrochemical, construction, agribusiness, wood product companies, industrial fishing, factory farming, packaging, and plastic. There's a big one, plastic, disposable products of all sorts, and the war industries are significant contributors, the biggest institutional contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. The result of revamping all this would be millions of workers out of a job, right? The capitalist system can't really address that problem. So more fundamentally, think about it this way. A corporation that can't promise growth is a corporation that will soon be out of business. The global economy consists of many such corporations. And so the result is that capitalism requires perpetual economic growth in order to avoid economic crises like the Great Depression. To be more specific, in order to stave off mass unemployment and economic misery, capitalism requires increasing commodity production, escalating resource extraction, increasing trash and toxic dumping, and ever-increasing energy production. So this brings the talk to a final conclusion, a fundamental contradiction. The contradiction is capitalism's grow or die imperative, that is the requirement for economic growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, the finite ecological limits of the planet. On the far right, I don't know, it might be too small for you to see. This is a cartoon by Stephanie McMillan, who was my collaborator on a book. The hamster says, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And the rabbit says, you're obviously not an economist. So what this brings us to, and what system change, not climate change, is all about, is that we need an alternative system of human cooperation. So that's usually called eco-socialism in these circles. And there's been a lot written about eco-socialism. There'll probably be a lot more. So to learn more about that, let me direct you to the System Change, Not Climate Change website, which is just those words, no spaces, systemchangenotclimatechange.org. And also for people who are not already active in this area, a really good organization to join is the Democratic Socialists of America, which brings us to our next speaker, Aura, who is a leader within that organization. And I work under her and with her on projects in the Climate Justice Committee of Los Angeles. She's really done some fantastic work. And so I will give up my screen now and turn it over to Aura.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, David. It was such a great explanation and setting up, the stage for all of us this Sunday morning to dived into this conversation of, is it net zero real or not? And I think that's the question that we're trying to answer here. So I want to commend you for all the work that you have done for at DSA and all of the, we have hosted many webinars like this one. So I hope that you will keep in touch with us and join our efforts. So first, I want to just encourage you to use the reactions that are below next to, your chat. They look more or less like this. If it's something that you love that I'm saying, this is, a good way to communicate with me without saying anything. And I also want you to join me to give a little clap for David for his great, and fantastic presentation, and for all the work and the research that he has done. So we can all practice. So the reactions are right next to the chat in the bottom. And it's quite fun to do it. So, okay, so thank you, David, so much. So I'm Aura Vasquez. I am an environmental justice organizer and advocate. I'm a former commissioner, board member for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is the largest publicly owned utility in the country. I am the co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America in Los Angeles Climate Justice Committee, and a lot more. I do a lot more. And I want to present to you a couple of ideas and some thought-provoking conversation that is really rooted in my own experience as an Afro-Latina from Colombia and as a woman of color. So, many months ago, I started my career also on trying to figure out how do we tackle the issue of climate change. So back in the 80s, I saw a show about the ozone layer. If you guys remember global warming, this was the issue at hand in those days, and it wasn't very well, advertised or promoted because we were kind of like at the beginning stages of even understanding what global warming and climate change was. So my first kind of campaign at 11 years old was to help my school start the first environmental club, and also get a more awareness around global warming. And back then, you remember, it was like the aerosols was the problem. We didn't really have a lot of understanding, and if we did, it was very hidden, in those days. So I found myself 30 years later in California, in Los Angeles, organizing with the Sierra Club, getting LA off of coal. And this was the first time that I could make a connection on something happening in California with something global, at least for me. I think for a lot of you that are a little more familiar with this issue and that have been working on this issue for so long, the connection was clear. But for me as an organizer to connect communities of color here and connect communities of color in Arizona, where we were getting our coal power from, for example, for one of those coal plants, was something very transformative. And to get Angelenos to really understand why this was important and why we were sending, money in those days was $500 million. We were sending annually to one coal plant out of state. This was not developing local jobs or even helping us, fight really climate change. So we started a very exciting campaign, and that's kind of how I cut my teeth on. But we knew intuitively that was not the end, that not just getting off of coal, but that the fossil fuel industry as a whole was a huge issue. That the way that we transport ourselves was an issue. Using gas, plastics were a huge, it still are. It's a huge issue and something that was created also by the fossil fuel industry. So later when I joined DSA LA, we started really thinking about this question. How do we decarbonize? What will be like our biggest impact And we're a small and mighty group, and we started really thinking about what are some of the things that we can do to really mitigate the effects of climate change in the second largest city in the country. What are some of the things that we can do? So in our research, we came about two different things that we wanted to do. We understood that stationary sources like buildings and homes were a huge problem. And but we also understood something else, which was that we couldn't leave behind those communities that were most affected by climate change and by pollution. That it was imperative, that it was very important for us as we develop our campaign strategy to understand that we needed to do work that was benefiting, them. And I want to retake a little bit of one of the slides that David spoke about, which is carbon credits, and this false narrative that that's really going to get us to the finish line. This is what we call market-based solutions that only benefit corporations. They're not benefiting working class folks. They're not benefiting people that have asthma, but they're actually, with these carbon credits, it's kind of like having a good, pat in the back. Oh yeah, I'm doing so great. And what a lot of companies do now is that they swap those credits and they actually don't stop emitting any carbon, which is very problematic. Now, another piece of that solution is that some of that money, quote unquote, needs to be invested in communities of color, in environmental justice communities that are affected by, by pollution and by climate change. So it makes a community that is already burdened by this issue dependent on the issue, on the problem. And this is extremely problematic. So I wanted to get you guys into that framing, into that understanding that the solutions that we find, the solutions that we advocate for, the solutions that we aspire to need to be intersectional, and that they also need to be things that really benefit communities of color and environmental justice communities first, because otherwise we're just in the capitalist ham wheel. Like we're just going around and around and around, and we're not really, doing anything. So as we were pounding in that kind of question, so like, how can we truthfully, hands-on do it in Los Angeles? We came about two things. So there was a big movement in creating something called the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. This was the space where environmental justice communities in Los Angeles could gather, talk to our government and have a seat on the table. This is the first time LA had something, something even remotely like this. We had sustainability officers and sustainability programs, but we did not have something that was really committed to uplift communities of color. So that started. So then that was a space where all of the EJ communities and groups, including us, could join and organize. And that was very powerful, because out of that, something was born, and I'm gonna post it here on the chat, that was like life-changing for us. So two policies were born out of this place. Let me see if okay, perfect. And one being, related to the Green New Deal. And this dealt with the idea of, okay, if we're gonna decarbonize buildings, if we know that that's important, how we're gonna go about it, how we're gonna do it. And we also, one of the first pieces of that cake in decarbonizing was electrifying buildings. But here we had like our first kind of roadblock. In a lot of places, especially in low-income communities, when you have when you change something in the building or in the apartment, a lot of landlords utilize that as a way to evict tenants, and that's very problematic. So we wanted to make sure, and this is the intersectionality between things like housing and the environment. So we wanted to make sure that these upgrades or these benefits were benefiting people, but at the same time, not getting them in more of a problem that they originally had. So that was like the first roadblock. So a lot of organizations started getting together, a lot of community. We became part of that coalition to really protect renters as we protect our environment. But something was happening at the same time that was really the right timing. Electorally, DSA has been working with a lot of candidates to help them get elected to office. And one of the people that we supported in 2020 introduced one of these ordinances, and her name is Nitya Raman, which was electrifying new buildings. And that was kind of like the low-hanging fruit for us. And it was something that we could win and that we could get behind. This was not easy. We're talking about the gas, industry. We're talking about asking an industry for, that has been empowered, that has polluted our environment and our political process for so long, to basically, we were defying that, that power. And last year, we were very successful that we were able to pass a decarbonization ordinance for new buildings in Los Angeles, making this idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions as much as we could. In existing buildings, we're still working on that because, as I said, we want to really be conscious about how these maybe unwanted benefits or like these benefits can have unwanted, repercussions. So we're still kind of figuring out how this is gonna maybe contribute to more evictions and to the issue of homelessness here in LA. How we can work with other agencies and even other campaigns, at least here in DSA, to make sure that displacement and gentrification wasn't happening in the name of the environment, which I think, we kind of saw a little bit of that in when the solar boom happened, where, people, where people had a solar panel, but only people that had a home and that had a good roof and good credit could have solar. Unlike, for example, somebody like me that I'm a renter and I couldn't really have a solar panel because, I don't own my home. So this leads me to the conversation about the Green New Deal, which was introduced as a resolution, as an aspiration, as something that we wanted to do one day, as something that we wanted to move towards in the future. And as you know, it really caught fire, and it was a really interesting time, and it really put the environment back in the front and in the top of the minds of folks. So that was really, interesting time. And in LA, we have a local Green New Deal that is not very robust. And as we saw the corruption of, this term and the spirit of this policy really, getting nowhere. But this is something that we at DSA were really behind. So something else that I want to discuss besides the Green New Deal is that in the market-based solution. So guys, I don't know how many, please let me know with a thumbs up, how many of you have been to a communist country yourself? I have been to a communist country. Raise your hand. Yeah, because we often, and I struggle a little bit with this with DSA, is that we often talk about capitalism as if it's something external, as if like countries like Cuba or well, Russia's not really communism, but like China. We often talk about capitalism as something that is external. I want to remind all of you here that we're part of capitalism. All of us here. So as we think about how do we benefit the environment and how do we like defeat capitalism, which I think is something that we use from time to time, we got to slice that cake in many little places, you know, because we live in a constraint, and David talks a lot about this in our group. We live under the constraint of capitalism right now. So if we were to completely demolish and finish capitalism, how would that look like? In Los Angeles, we have a little bit of an advantage, or a little bit of there's a little difference here, that at least we have a public utility that belongs to all Angelenos that pay the bill. So in that sense, we can advocate to DWP, we can work, you know, to address some of these issues, and also we can you know, make sure that things are working better for working class people. So things like co-ops, things like making solar for renters, things that make it more accessible for all of us to be part of the solution, is something that we can start striving to right now. And that's kind of what has been the focus at DSA, because I am not here to sit an ideology. I'm a person that has asthma, and my community right now, a lot of the people that look like me live in high polluted places. We see what's happening in East Palestine. High capitalism at its best, you know, but we can make it better. And we can make a lot of those solutions work for working class people. And also for you know, creating jobs, making it distributed. This is a term that we use a lot in the energy sector, distributed generation. How are we going to make power how are we going to democratize power? How are we going to give it back to everyone, and not just one corporation, or not just one gas plant or coal plant or something in the desert, which is usually where they sit, at least in the West, or, you know, or in a Native American reservation? How do we make sure that is you know, that is distributed? So I want to bring you guys back to the chilling reality that we live under the constraints of capitalism, and that as we make a world that is maybe more socialist, at least for us at DSA, we can benefit workers, we can benefit communities of color that are in environmental justice communities, and we can dismantle all these market-based solutions like carbon credits that really don't benefit anyone, that actually are making communities more addicted to the problem. That as you recycle, go in your bicycle, maybe have you know, take public transit or have an EV car, as you have maybe solar panels, or maybe you adopt to a community solar program in your community, that you also think about divesting from banks that support a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, which is actually kind of hard to find a bank that doesn't, you know, that as you, you know, continue doing this work, you also vote for people that are committed to bring forward these ideas, and not just in the environment, because we need intersectionality. This is also an issue, as I just shared, in housing and the military, you know, complex. This is also an issue of color. This is why it's an environmental justice issue, you know. So it's all of these different pieces are interconnected. So as we think about solutions, don't leave all these things behind, because in the constraints of a capitalist society or world that we live in, we're going to have to get a lot more creative and a lot more focused on the things that we want. And like I said, I rest reassured, and at DSA, we had gone to somewhat a sweet spot where we advocate for environmental justice communities and you know, distribute of resources. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. I can tell you it's not perfect. But at least we have come to a place where we want to be part of the solution and not just talk about the solution. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you so much. And I think I'll pass it back to Ted.
Thank you very much, David and Aura, for those very interesting presentations. From David's, which is about 60,000 feet off the ground from the stratosphere, looking at what's going on here on Earth and what we need to change, to Aura talking about things that are going on in LA and the struggle there. And I'm going to just say right off the bat that I think we're going to run a little long here today, because we have a lot of questions that came to us before through the email system. Basically, people emailed us questions in advance, and so we'll get into some of those. And I want to toss first to David a question that comes really out of the thing that Aura was just discussing, which is the relationship between these struggles at the grassroots level and the really desperate situation that you spoke of. And one way that's been framed, I think Ken put it in the chat, was that your presentation shows that the climate crisis cannot end as long as the capitalist system is continuing to exist. It's a fundamental contradiction in our efforts. Shouldn't we be calling for a revolutionary change and the building of a new economic system? And how do we relate the work that is so granular and you know, at the grassroots level with this much more grand scheme of overturning the entire capitalist system?
Yeah, okay, well, that's you know, a centrally important question. Let me say first that there's not actually a possibility of solving you know, the climate crisis. Think of it more as shades of gray, you know, like as a continuum of outcomes. So within the capitalist framework, we can't address it very well, but we can address it some. You know, there's some room for reform. So, for example, you look at some of the you know, Northern European countries compared to the US or China, they do better. I mean, they still have significant emissions, but they're much, much lower. And they're, you know, there you have the working class has a greater balance of power. So roughly speaking, when you look around the world at these countries, what they're doing, the less capitalism, the better in terms of the environment. But within the framework of capitalism, we do have some maneuvering room. We can do things to buy time. Organizations like Food and Water Watch are really on top of that, you know, doing some important stuff. At the same time that, you know, we're working to halt the destruction or limit the destruction, we need to be pushing toward ending capitalism and establishing some kind of eco-socialism. So roughly the idea, I think, is that we push and push and push to get all the reforms we can within the framework of capitalism. Then that's not going to be enough. So we push some more, and then there's a crisis. The system can't answer to those responses. And to achieve this, we need you know, a self-emancipated working class, working class with, you know, far greater unity than we have now. And I think, you know, one of the real barriers to that right now is identity politics. You know, you look, 74 million people voted for Trump. There's got to be a lot of workers in there, right? 74 million people. So we need to find a way to overcome the, you know, the identity politics, which has been a real gift to capitalism. You know, like white identity politics is, you know, it's like our history is being threatened and all kinds of other racist bullshit. But there's some identity politics on the left, which is not constructive, and we need to reach out and somehow find a way to build I think, with workers. Because the the light switch for capitalism, the on-off switch of capitalism is surplus value. That's why the workers have to be in leadership to get rid of capitalism. That's what makes capitalism work, the surplus value, and only the working class can turn that off. Okay, I've talked too much. I'll stop.
So the next question I'm going to toss it, Aura, to you, and it's about hundreds of billions of dollars for climate action are supposed to be headed towards the states. Well, I guess Los Angeles is probably bigger than most states, so there'll probably be billions of dollars headed towards Los Angeles. And how, from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, how is this money on your radar? Are you able to, within the organization that you're, the Climate Action Committee of Los Angeles DSA, are you able to address this issue of this huge flow of money and where it's going to go?
That's a great question. I'm glad you're bringing it up, because the way that these funds are distributed is the federal level, release this aid. The states get it first. So in the state of California, Gavin Newsom and his cabinet and such, and then they distribute that to the counties. So in LA, we have like the county of LA, if you're in Orange County and such. And then the county and the city kind of like negotiate for that money. Here is the problem. And this is one of the constraints to live in this capitalist society. We have such a bureaucratic process that by the time those funds get to real solutions, it's not even enough. I mean, we saw David's presentation, and we're all in agreement of the magnitude of the problem here, right? Like, I think we know that this is going to be a multi-trillion, this is a multi-trillion problem that we're not going to be able to solve with it's something. And at DSA, we don't often focus on advocating on those type of things because we want to continue kind of like squeezing the idea that capitalism is not really working for us. It's gonna, of course, create jobs and such, but it's not something that we're like very focused on. The other thing is that the fossil fuel industry got a really good handle of this stuff too. I mean, Manchin, who is a Congress member from West Virginia, who basically was the one who delivered the latest votes to, for the IRA, the infrastructure and the act is extremely problematic because they have a lot of benefits for themselves. So for example, as we're getting all these resources, monetary resources to our state, Gavin Newsom has been the governor that has approved the most permits on fossil fuel infrastructure at the state. So, so we have elected officials here that are speaking on both sides of their mouth. They love to say that California is such a green state and that we are leaders on climate and such, but then at the same time, they're doing all these things that are not, really truthful to what they say they're gonna do. So this is why it's so important, whether you're a DSA, ABC, Z, XG, whatever you wanna be in, whatever group you are, to like really get involved in electoral work. You can't do one without the other. You can't talk about the Black Lives Matter and that we need to that we need to end the military complex without really getting electoral, without supporting people that are going to be good environmental stewards, that are really going to fight for these things and are going to speak about it. You can't say that you are even a socialist or completely against everything that is happening if you're not supporting and uplifting people that are running for office that are on your camp. And what I mean that are your camp is that are people that are really care and that are going to bring up these issues, because then you're part of the problem, because then we elect what we call the establishment, and this is what the establishment does. So yes, it sounds great that we're gonna have, I think they approved how much money? $3 trillion on aid for all over the states. But don't get it twisted. A lot of that money is not really going to environmental issues that are gonna help us reduce greenhouse gases or that are gonna help communities of color. There's some money there. But the other side, the fossil fuel industry is getting a huge chunk. So I just wanted to like offer that, because at DSA, we're entering another period, which is the hydrogen talk, the so-called green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen, which is a complete greenwashing practice. And we just see this over and over. This isn't the first time that we see, these kind of resources coming in from the federal government, but it's not really us who's taking the benefit. Because if they were really truthful about putting the environment first, then we will be really, all the infrastructure will be around, solutions to reduce, carbon emissions.
Yeah. So a follow-up question there, but and it's coming from Chris. As a member of the building trades, I agree with Auro's point about changing the way we construct buildings. I'm wondering how groups like System Change and DSA are reaching out to the trades to create coalitions. And, in particular with this respect to the electrification campaign, has there been outreach with unions?
Yeah, so we have, we do support and do a lot of work with like around Decarbonizing LA or the electrification ordinance. The plumbing union was very supportive of our work. I have to say, Chris, I'm so glad that you're part of this conversation, because I don't know how many, I'm a little surprised that the trades have not gone ahead of the Green New Deal. I was hoping that the trades were going to lead the Green New Deal. That would have been incredible, because those jobs really belong to you guys. In California, sadly, we see a lot of the trades aligning with utilities and with the fossil fuel industry because they want to protect jobs. And at DSA, we're part of a coalition called Repower LA, which also has a lot of unions, especially IBWs. In our case, IBW Local 18, where we have created pipeline and apprentices programs for folks that are like want to enter the electrical sector, and especially folks that are in reentry. So they were maybe incarcerated at some point, folks that have been homeless, folks that are low income, folks that come from communities of color. So that has worked really well. And at DSA, we have, actually, I feel like it's the strongest, it's one of the things that we do really well, really work with other unions and other trades. Unlike, other groups that, the NRDCs of the world, or, environmental groups where sometimes they're in hearings and the trades are like defending jobs and, the environmental groups are defending the environment. There is so much more work to do. And I hope that since you're here in this conversation, you can be one of those, supporters that is pushing your own union to really get an understanding of what the Green New Deal and that you, like I said, to me, when AOC kind of came up with this policy, I thought that the trades were going to be all over it, because she was kind of demanding a huge component in jobs. And we see it happening. But it's going to be a just transition. And I don't know if you guys have heard of this term, a just transition, which relates to how do we help workers, that work and have benefits, in the fossil fuel industry, kind of do the jump or move towards, to the renewable energy or the electrification sector.
So I'm gonna pivot a little bit here now to David for a question about what you projected in terms of what needs to happen with all of these industries that have to be shut down, and you had really a whole lot of the modern world kind of embraced there. Certainly, I think we can all agree that the military industrial complex is not benefiting humankind or the planet. But many other things are harder for people to envision disappearing, like aviation. Even I'm sure that within this crowd here, many have taken a flight in the last year, and some have sworn off. But it's really, you had quite a vision there. And how do you deal with the question of people just being very frightened or can't imagine the possibility of dealing with all of this? What is the psychological way to get through past that resistance that basically, Mark Jacobson, a Stanford engineering professor, says we can engineer our way out of this, that it's technically feasible, but people see it as sort of politically impossible.
Yeah, well, that's quite a lot. I think a key step, or a key goal, I should say, of restructuring our economics, even within the framework of capitalism, is to nationalize the major fossil fuel companies with a view to phasing them out. So that's already a big project. All the other industries that depend on fossil fuels have to be revamped. I mean, it's a huge project, but it's a matter of survival too. This is really what we have to do. This notion that if we just all ride bicycles and recycle plastic bags, it just isn't going to do it. It's really a systemic problem, and it's really built into the capitalist system. So that's a big job. I mean, I don't have a magic key for that, silver bullet, whatever. Ted, what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Well, that's basically, the question is the psychological barriers that people have to imagining the transformation of this entire society.
Well, I get depressed about it just like anybody else might do. It's a huge job, but keep in mind, it's not an either or. Either we solve it or we don't solve it. It's a continuum. So we have the real opportunities to limit the damage, and we're going to see some damage. But it's kind of like the difference between being hit in the head by a tennis ball or being hit in the head by a bowling ball. I mean, you want to lean more towards the tennis ball, right? So we want to limit the damage as much as we can. One thing, I used to tell my students who asked, well, what can we do? One thing you really can do that's very helpful, I think, is to twice a week say something bad about capitalism to somebody you know. The word capitalism is almost a sacred word. You don't hear it in polite company, except maybe on Fox News where they praise it. But capitalism is considered, to even raise the term, makes people suspect maybe you're controversial. So we have to normalize discussion of capitalism as something that we really have to get rid of. It's a failed economic system. It's destroying the planet, and it's doing a lot of other horrible things, even within its own framework. I mean, it's resulted in the greatest concentration of wealth in the history of humanity. So we have to really speak openly against it. And I think that's one thing that both DSA and System Change have done very well, is to try to normalize that discussion.
So, Aura, would you like to address that question of how we present a positive perspective to people that they can be attracted towards, and get them out of the slough of despond, as it were, the absolute. I think there's so many young people that are very pessimistic at this point. And pessimism leads to political apathy, and
Unfortunately.
we can do nothing. And that seems to be like,
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter. Why do I care? My vote doesn't count, or it's just LA. We have India, China, so, and this is a really good question. So I got two things. The way that we speak about these issues matters. So we're in a room where we're all friends and we kind of have the same values and agree on a few things. We know, we understand that capitalism is a problem. We can openly talk about it and nobody grinch, like it's fine. But I don't know if I can go to my neighbor across the street and talk so freely with them about this issue without them thinking that I'm maybe a little crazy, So I invite all of you to, to really dive in deeper about how you talk about this with others and how you taking people where they're at and not where you want them to be. And with that mindset, also share your stories, share what you care, share what it matters to you. Because in our organizing effort and at least for DSA, where we have adopted somewhat a relational model, right? We build communities, we build relationships with folks, and we work on these issues. It's important that other people learn our stories and learn what we're passionate about, what we do. And sometimes that personal story is more important than any facts that you can give somebody else. Sometimes understanding that maybe you grow up in a place where, climate change burned your home and this is what you feel passionate about this issue, is more powerful than giving all of the statistics that David, gave. Young people are so ready, and it's so exciting for me to see them being so involved. And I also feel they need a lot of our direction and a lot of our support. They don't have a lot of institutional knowledge of what happened before, so it's important for us to share best practices of what worked and what didn't work. And, I hear a couple of years ago, I read this study about the way that we talk about climate and in general for the whole United States, and what was turning people on and what was turning people off. And one thing that I remember is, like, for example, people using eradicate. We're eradicating this and we're eradicating that. And how in some communities that was a really turn off. Because again, I leave you with this organizing principle, which is taking people where they're at and not where you want them to be. I'm ready to eradicate. I'm ready for the revolution, guys. Like, please, if you're ready for it, raise your hand, your virtual hand. I am ready. I'm ready for radical change. I think there's no time to waste. I cannot transfer more of the urgency to people. But I know my roommate is not there yet. She can hardly recycle. I'm still trying to get her to, like, honey, plastic doesn't go there, go here, So we have to take people where they're at, because not all of them are ready for the revolution. And it's funny, some people think here in Los Angeles, some people think that I'm very radical, and especially when I talk about these issues. But we're talking about our world. We're talking about what we're leaving future generations. We're talking about an economic struggle that if we don't get ahead of climate change, this is going to be catastrophic. So if the investors and the capitalists believe that this is going to get better for them, I'm sorry to tell you, it's not. But they're always going to manage to make it better for them. So it's like, how do we make it better for all of us? So share your stories.
So I guess we have some other questions here that are more directed specifically to some of the things that came up, but about real zero and net zero. And one is a company called Next Era Energy claims it has a, quote, a plan to lead the decarbonization of America by reducing carbon emissions and acquiring traditional offsets or credits. And it actually put the trademark symbol, it has a trademark on real zero, TM. Okay, real zero in quotes with the TM.
Market base.
I don't know. So that
David,
means
go for it.
a registered trademark. And in its June 2022 news release, the company claims it has created the zero carbon blueprint, again with a trademark symbol on it. So this is a comprehensive plan to significantly increase renewable energy deployment and lead the $4 trillion market opportunity to decarbonize the U.S. economy. So can you can both of you address this issue, either of you, about how real zero, even real zero language like that gets appropriated by the conventional capitalist free market system and reprocessed and co-opted?
Yeah, there's no end to the commodification of the commons by capitalism. I mean, they've commodified water. You know, it used to be when I was younger, people didn't drink out of bottles; they just drank water out of water fountains. They're probably going to commodify air. They commodify ideas. They've already commodified net zero, and now this, I guess, is a step toward real zero. They're a step ahead of this meeting. But the corporations are, they can't lead. A corporation isn't going to lead us to safety out of the climate crisis. The corporations really have to be abolished. And, to do that, we have to build more working class structures. And I think somebody, Marion, maybe pointed out that the importance of demonstrations and, being very visible in public actions. And Andreas Malm has talked about, stepping up the resistance to, the capitalist ecocide of this planet, doing things, like letting the air out of tires of big SUVs and leaving a note on the windshield, and maybe escalating from there. It's a crisis. It's the greatest crisis humanity's ever faced, and it's not really being treated like that, as Greta Thunberg often points out. Beyond that, I'm not really sure what to say. Thanks.
I don't even know if you can say any more of that, David. I wholeheartedly agree. I think somebody mentioned in the chat, I spoke very briefly about banking. Again, this got to be a global, individually global solution, guys. As you recycle and as you go to your city council meeting and vote for the right people, you also need to stop banking with these people that are investing on fossil fuels. Like now we have other banks that are great. If you know some, please post them in the chat. I bank particularly with Aspiration, which is like committed solely to the environment. So important things. And one of the tactics, somebody mentioned public demonstrations, or I'm thinking rallies and such. The mainstream environmental movement got hit a couple years ago very harshly. The Greenpeaces of the world, the 350.orgs of the world, they got sued by the fossil fuel industry, and the fossil fuel industry got them in the, spending all of their funding on lawyers and trying to just defend themselves. They're very savvy. So people that had a lot of global influence just couldn't keep up with lawsuits and such. So again, I like the emphasis on organizing, because rallies are the largest demonstration of our collective power, and they're very important. I organized the People Climate March when Trump got elected in Washington, D.C. Lots of money got involved, lots of celebrities, all that. It was great. It makes us feel good. Ask me how much stuff have come out of that after that rally. It takes a lot of our resources. We got to get smarter because we don't have a lot. We can't compete with their money, and with capitalist money either. So organizing to me is always like the way to go personally, because again, they change in minds and hearts. It doesn't cost much, and it's a great leadership development for all of us.
Well, thank you very much. I think on that note, we've run up to the end of our time, run a little over, and I want to thank both David and Aura for the excellent presentations. For System Change, Not Climate Change, I want to invite all to check out our website. You can find a bunch of links there for whether you want to sign up for our newsletter, which will keep you posted about future events like this. Next month, there'll be a webinar on the subject of hydrogen, hydrogen hype. And you'll find also there links to our YouTube channel, where this and other webinars have been posted, will be posted. And thank you very, very much all for coming. If you'd like to stay for a little bit longer, we'll keep the chat open and we'll keep the Zoom going for a bit longer. And to our YouTube and Facebook viewers, see you next time. Thanks for joining us.